This is Bishop Edward Weisenburger here in Tucson, and I'm speaking today with Joanna Williams, the Executive Director of the Kino Border Initiative. I usually just refer to it as the KBI. Joanna, tell us a little bit about the Kino Border Initiative, especially for those who maybe didn't hear our last segment a few weeks ago when we were speaking, and tell me a little bit about its purpose and its history.
Yeah, thank you so much for welcoming me here, and thank you for joining us watching this video. So the Kino Border Initiative, we were founded in 2008, really as a collaborative of many different entities of the church, both dioceses, the Jesuits, the Missionary Sisters of the Eucharist. But the real heart of our goal is to promote migration with dignity, which for us means let's recognize that the people who are migrants at the border, they're made in the image and likeness of God. They have dignity. That can't be taken away from them or given from them, but we can recognize it and we can respect it. So we respect that dignity by providing humanitarian services, so food, shelter, medical assistance. But we also respect that dignity by helping societies and communities in the US and Mexico to get to know migrants a little bit better, to have that, what Pope Francis calls a space of encounter, so that they might be motivated to work together with the migrants at the border towards a better world.
Nothing can replace encounter. I mean, the first time I went to the KBI, I went down to the Comodore, the old one, the really tiny one, and I saw so many hungry people being fed. It was it was a powerful moment for me. And I sometimes think of my older sister, who's a grandmother of 6, and she always says, in the discussion on immigration, if my children were starving, I'd crawl on my knees to keep them alive. And yet we sometimes don't think of the person, we think of the issue, or we even think of persons as an issue. And this is so critical that we have that encounter. Now, have you ever, what's the way to phrase it? Have you ever felt conflicted by your role on the border? And if so, how did your Catholic faith speak to that or give you some kind of guidance, if it did?
I think I feel conflicted a lot at the border. I think there's this image of, the people doing humanitarian assistance at the border as if we just know we're on our moral high ground and we continue on. And the reality is that the situation at the border is so complex.
Right.
Sometimes it's hard to know the way forward. I think of an example from a few years ago. I had just come off of retreat, so I'd been a week in silent prayer and all renewed with the Spirit, and I show up at the border. And I see these families on the Mexican side of the border. Now at that point, and now it might seem normal now, but at that point when somebody was fleeing violence, they could just arrive to the port of entry, talk to a Customs and Border Protection officer, and they'd be processed into asylum. But then all of a sudden, right off of my retreat, just as I'm just trying to get home, I see this family that has been turned away by Customs and Border Protection. And I felt confused in that moment. I actually called CBP and I said, what's going on? Because we have a good relationship, we communicate with CBP. They said, we're just a little over capacity, but we're going to work on processing this family. And I believe them. There's people I've worked with over the course of years. And then it continued to get worse and worse, where more and more families were being turned away. They were stranded on the Mexican side. And we started to provide a humanitarian response from the Kino Border Initiative. But I also started to get more and more suspicious of what's really going on here. It just doesn't seem like things are adding up. And sure enough, when the monthly numbers came out, I called CBP again and I said, but you're not processing as many people as you used to. So is it truly a capacity issue? And I started to feel really like I was even being taken advantage of in the situation, where because we were providing shelter and because we were providing food, they were kind of being used as an excuse to impose a new policy. And I think people right now might feel the same way about situations at the border, where they've had this sense of, I'm being taken advantage of, the situation's out of my control. And so I started reflecting. Fortunately, I was fresh off of my retreat, so I was able to kind of go back to that
Nothing
space.
helps quite like a good retreat.
Yeah, I highly recommend it for all of our viewing
A reset,
public.
A spiritual reset.
But I was able to go back to Scripture and see how many times the apostles, in their interaction with Jesus, were always trying to keep things under control. They're, those children, they can't get close to Jesus. Oh, that woman that's bleeding, stay away. And even when Peter's up in the moment of transfiguration, I'm trying to build some tents so that I can make sense of this.
Or one of my favorite is, we have nothing to feed them with, so send them away.
Exactly. So God really convicted me in that moment. I said, well, who am I to contain the abundance and generosity of God's love? You know, what I've been called to do here is to continue to provide a humanitarian response, to continue to love abundantly, not worry about, am I being taken advantage of? That's well above my pay grade. But it is, and so there's that humanitarian response, but it doesn't mean that I totally ignore the structural factors.
Right.
And I think the church gives us the lens to do that too, to say we can be thoughtful about what are the broader movements in society that are creating this, and we can provide a credible witness. We can give testimony to what's happening, because we don't get involved in politics in a way that's divorced from the individual people. I think that's the real power of the church's work in politics. So it's always grounded in our relationship with the people being affected by policy.
Yeah.
So those two things gave me a way forward in this complicated moment that only became more complicated since then. But at least God's given me the tools for it.
But that's very helpful. Are there any people that maybe have given you a witness, whether it's positive or a negative witness, but any people that have given you kind of a witness or given you an example that speaks to you?
One person that comes to mind is a woman named Antelma, I met her, gosh, it must have been 11 years ago. She'd been living in Chicago. She had 2 kids in Chicago, and her mother had become very sick, so she had to come back to Mexico to take care of her mother in her last days. And then she didn't have documents to get back into the country, so now she's separated from her children. And I've followed Antelma and been in relationship with Antelma over the course of the last 11 years. Nothing in her life has been simple ever since, so I visited her when she was in detention up here in Eloy Detention Center, just a little north of Tucson. I accompanied her as then she went back to her hometown to try to make a life there, as she got threatened by organized crime and then fled back up to the U.S. Now she's actually back in Chicago in the middle of an asylum process, but she's with her kids. And life there is still even complicated. It's not like you make it to the U.S. and everything's simple.
Right, right.
But I think the reason that walking alongside Antelma has moved me so much because I can identify her with her love as a mother who just wants to be with her children, and that resilience and persistence that she has to never take a full no, but always look for what's the next step? Where can I go? What's my way out? And my parents made fun of me when I was a little kid. I was learning to ride a bike, and with my brother, he would make a little bit of progress, and he would jump in excitement and raise his hands and come running back for a hug, and I would grip my teeth and I would get back on the bike and I would try to make it a little further, and that's why I identify with Antelma. It's this attitude of, I think that I can make it a little further. And
there's something blessed in our scriptures and in our church tradition about perseverance. We're a culture that no longer understands really perseverance. And for people to maintain that grasp on hope and to continue to persevere really speaks to me, it resonates with me. Well, Joanna, this is very helpful for us to hear, especially from someone who's right there on the edge of all this that's unfolding. And I'm not here to flatter you, but I'm very moved by that ability to balance. Yes, there are movements happening on our national and international level and maybe our statewide level, but there's also the immediacy of those that you encounter. And I'm going to respond to those people. And that approach really speaks to me, and I think it speaks to many who follow Jesus Christ. Thank you so much. God bless.
Thank you for welcoming me here.